My sister slapped me in front of 600 people hard enough to turn my face sideways. For half a second, the ballroom went silent. Then Chloe grabbed the microphone from the startled MC and laughed. "Look at this ugly, useless crow. She sits behind a desk labeling dead people's papers and thinks she knows what real work looks like." A few tables laughed. Then more. My father stayed in his chair. My stepmother, Denise, gave me the look she had been giving me since I was 17, the one that meant, "Be sensible. Don't ruin this for everyone." My name is Rebecca Shaw. I'm 40 years old, and I'm a senior digital archivist and records manager at Hensley University. I make my living tracking where records come from, who changed them, and whether the story attached to them is actually true. Which was why, even with my cheek burning, I knew Chloe had just made a mistake much bigger than slapping me. She had spent the evening bragging that the Riverton Heritage Society was about to land a $100,000 university digitization contract. What she apparently didn't know was that I was Hensley's technical project lead and contract administrator for that initiative. The university representative announced my name less than 2 minutes later. The laughter died so fast I could hear somebody set down a champagne glass 3 tables away. Chloe went white. Denise stopped smiling, but I wasn't looking at either of them. I was looking at the navy folder beside my plate. Denise had placed it there before dinner. A yellow tab stuck from the side. "Sign here." Inside was a statement saying the work Chloe had just claimed as her own had been created through a collaborative Shaw family effort. They expected my signature underneath it. I didn't sign. And the next morning, when I opened Chloe's $100,000 proposal, I found a sentence I recognized immediately. I recognized it because I had written it 7 years earlier. Only now, someone else's name was underneath it. But to understand why that mattered more to me than the slap, you have to understand something about names. I've spent most of my life making sure other people's names don't disappear. 4 days before the gala, I was standing in the digital preservation lab at Hensley University with a graduate assistant named Aaron, who was about to rename 300 image files before he'd created preservation copies. "Stop," I said. His hand froze over the keyboard. He looked guilty enough that I almost laughed. "I haven't done anything yet. That's why I'm still smiling." He rolled his chair back. On his screen was a folder from a donor collection, photographs, letters, handwritten recipe cards, church programs, and a shoebox worth of snapshots from the 1940s through the 1970s. Aaron pointed at the file names. "They're a mess. They're supposed to be a mess. They're called IMG 0047 and stuff like that. Those are the names the files arrived with. That doesn't make them useful. No, but it makes them original." I leaned over his shoulder and pointed at the workflow sheet taped beside the monitor. "Preserve first, normalize second." He repeated it under his breath. "Preserve first, normalize second. That way, if something goes wrong later, we know what we received and what we changed." He nodded. I picked up the black archival pencil I kept behind my ear and wrote a collection number on the paper sleeve holding one of the physical photographs. A woman stood in front of a textile mill with 6 other women, all of them in work dresses, their sleeves rolled to the elbow. 5 names were written on the back. The 6th had only a question mark. Aaron noticed me staring at it. "Does that bother you?" "Yes." "You don't know who she is." "That's why it bothers me." He smiled. "You really hate unidentified people." "I hate unidentified records." That sounded personal. It probably is. From the next workstation, my coworker Maya Chen looked over the top of her glasses. "Rebecca's idea of a horror movie is a box labeled miscellaneous. That is a horror movie." Aaron laughed and went back to his work. Maya rolled her chair toward me after he put on his headphones. "You doing anything fun this weekend?" "Heritage Gala." Her mouth twisted. "That wasn't what I asked." "It counts." "You working it?" "No, attending." "Really attending?" I knew what she meant. Mostly. "Rebecca." "What?" "The last time you attended something for your family, you spent 2 hours fixing exhibit captions in the coat room. That was different. It was a wedding anniversary display. The dates were wrong." Maya looked at me for a long second. "Do they know what your hourly rate is?" "Their family." That was not my question. I capped the pencil and slid it behind my ear again. Maya knew enough about my family to understand the outline, and not enough to hate anyone on my behalf. I liked that about her. She never said, "Your family is toxic." She asked questions. Questions were harder to dismiss. "My stepmother runs the society," I said. "I've volunteered there since high school." "I know. It's not like she forces me." "I didn't say she did." "Chloe's presenting Saturday. It's a big night for her." "Your sister?" "My half-sister." Maya lifted one eyebrow. "You always correct that." "I do not." "You just did." I looked back at the photograph. The unidentified woman was still there. Same dress as the others. Same factory wall. Same afternoon light. No name. I didn't answer Maya. That evening, I drove home to the condo I had owned for 6 years. There was nothing impressive about it. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, small kitchen, balcony overlooking a line of maple trees, and the back parking lot of a dental office. I loved it. The mortgage came out automatically on the 1st of every month. My retirement contributions came out before I saw my paycheck. I had enough in emergency savings to cover roughly 6 months if something went wrong. Nobody in my family had given me the down payment. Nobody paid my utilities. Nobody held my car title. Nobody could threaten to throw me out. That mattered because people later asked versions of the same question. Why did I put up with them? Why didn't I just leave? The answer was simple and embarrassing. I didn't need their money. I wanted their love. Money would have been easier. I heated leftover soup and opened my laptop at the kitchen counter. There were 3 emails from Denise. The first had the gala seating chart. The second had a draft donor brochure attached. The third was marked urgent. I opened that one first. "Rebecca, sweetheart, can you please check the dates on pages 8-11? Chloe is drowning and this needs to go to print tomorrow morning. You're so much faster at this stuff." I stared at the attachment. Then at the clock. 8:02 p.m. I had promised myself I wouldn't work on society materials that night. I also knew exactly what would happen if the brochure went to print with the wrong founding year for the Cresswell textile mill. Someone would point it out at the gala. Denise would be embarrassed. Chloe would panic. My father would say, "Rebecca, you knew that was wrong?" I opened the file. 15 minutes, I told myself. It took 43. I corrected 4 dates, 2 misspelled surnames, a duplicated caption, and a photograph credited to the wrong donor family. When I emailed it back, Denise replied in under a minute. "Lifesaver. Knew I could count on you." I should have felt appreciated. Instead, I looked at those 5 words and felt strangely tired. "Knew I could count on you." My family had been saying some version of that to me since I was 10 years old. The first time, I thought it was the nicest thing anyone had ever said. My mother's name was Elaine. She died when I was 10. For years afterward, the thing I remembered most clearly about the weeks after her funeral wasn't the church, or the flowers, or the casseroles people left in our refrigerator. It was a cardboard box. My father had taken family photographs down from shelves because people kept mailing us framed pictures of Mom, and he said he couldn't look at all of them every day. One afternoon, I found him on the living room floor sorting photographs. Some went into albums. Some went into a plain brown box. I sat beside him. There was one picture of my mother standing beside our Christmas tree in a green sweater, her hair tied back with a red ribbon. I turned it over. Nothing was written on the back. "What year was this?" Dad looked. 95, maybe. "How do you know?" "I was there." "But what if you forget?" He smiled like I had said something cute. "I won't forget your mother." "I might." His smile disappeared. I remember feeling guilty immediately, as if saying I might forget her was a kind of betrayal. I found a pencil. Not archival, just a yellow number 2 from school. On the back I wrote, "Elaine Shaw Christmas 1995. Dad watched me. My sensible girl. I looked up. He touched my hair. "You always think of these things." For a 10-year-old whose mother had just died, my sensible girl sounded like love. A year later, my father married Denise. I don't tell that part of my life as if Denise burst into our house wearing a black cape. She didn't. She cooked. She remembered birthdays. She brought bright curtains into rooms Dad had let go gray. When I had the flu, she sat a glass of water beside my bed and checked my temperature. When Chloe was born a year later, I was 12. I loved her. That matters. I knew how to warm a bottle before I knew how to wear mascara. I knew which stuffed rabbit made Chloe stop crying. I knew where Denise kept the infant Tylenol and which cabinet held extra diapers. People would say, "Rebecca is such a good big sister." Denise would smile. "Rebecca's easy. She understands." I liked that too. Easy meant nobody regretted having me around. Understanding meant I wasn't a burden. By the time I was 17, Denise had become deeply involved with the Riverton Heritage Society. Riverton isn't tiny, but it behaves like a small town whenever reputation is involved. The same people sit on museum boards, preservation committees, arts councils, hospital foundations, university donor groups, and church committees. At fundraisers, everyone knows who donated the flowers. At Christmas, people remember whose name was on the historic theater restoration plaque. And if your family has been in Riverton long enough, people don't just know your last name. They know the story attached to it. Denise understood that better than anyone I ever met. She joined the Heritage Society first as a volunteer, then committee chair, then board member, and eventually chair. When I was 17, she asked me to help sort photographs. "You like this sort of thing," she said. She was right. The society occupied 2 floors of an old brick building near Main Street then. The basement smelled like dust, metal shelving, and old paper. I loved it. Boxes that looked meaningless to everyone else contained patterns. A woman in 3 photographs wearing the same brooch. A grocery receipt tucked into a diary. A name written in one hand and corrected in another. I learned that history didn't disappear all at once. It disappeared one unlabeled photograph at a time. Denise noticed I was good at it. Soon I wasn't just sorting. I was typing accession records, then checking dates, then building simple databases, then transcribing taped interviews. At first, I volunteered because I wanted to. That is another part that matters. Nobody stole 16 years of my time in one dramatic moment. I handed it over in pieces. A Saturday, then another Saturday. One evening after work. One vacation day. One emergency deadline. Every piece looked reasonable by itself. When I went to graduate school and later built a career in digital archives, the society became the place my family could say I had started. That made me feel loyal to it. And Denise knew how to ask. Never, "Rebecca, give me 20 unpaid hours." It was, "Can you just check these names? Can you take a quick look? Can you help Chloe get this one thing over the finish line? Can you save us from looking foolish?" The word save didn't get used every time, but it was always there. The first time I noticed how differently Chloe and I were treated was the Riverton Women of the Mill exhibit. I was 28. The society had received a collection of photographs and recorded interviews about women who worked at the Cresswell textile mill from the 1940s through its closing. I became obsessed with it. I spent months tracking down names. I found daughters and granddaughters of women in photographs. I listened to cassette transfers so distorted I sometimes replayed 5 seconds 10 times. I verified employment dates against city directories and union newsletters. One photograph showed 31 women standing in 3 rows outside the factory. 23 had names. By opening night, we had 29. I remember being proud of that number. Not because 29 sounded impressive, because 29 women no longer had question marks where their names belonged. Chloe was 16 then. She had just started volunteering at the society. She was funny, pretty, and fearless around strangers. I was none of those things. At the exhibit opening, Denise handed Chloe the introduction I had written. "Read this for us." Chloe's eyes widened. "Really?" "Of course. You connect with people." I was standing beside a folding table, checking name tags. I looked up. Denise caught my eye. "You don't mind, do you? You hate microphones." I did hate microphones. That was true. So I said, "No, it's fine." Chloe read my words beautifully. People applauded. A photographer from the Riverton Herald took a picture of Chloe beside the main exhibit. The article the next morning described her as a young volunteer helping bring forgotten women's stories back to life. My name appeared nowhere. Dad found me reading the article at breakfast. "You look upset." "I'm not." He sat opposite me. "You did a lot of work on that exhibit." "Yeah. You know you did it. I folded the newspaper. He smiled like he had solved the problem. Isn't that enough? I wanted to say no. Instead, I said, I guess. That answer became a habit. When I was 31, I was offered a 6-month digital humanities fellowship in Chicago. It wasn't glamorous money. It wasn't permanent. But it was exactly the kind of project I had wanted: large-scale digital preservation, community archives, new software systems, people from universities across the country. I printed the offer letter. I kept it on my kitchen table for 3 days. Then Denise called. The Society's centennial exhibition had lost its project coordinator. Nobody knows the collection the way you do. I'd be gone 6 months. That's exactly when we need you. I could help remotely. It's not the same. Dad called that night. Chloe finally has momentum there. Chloe was 19 and helping Denise with public programming. Dad said, this could be really good for her. I remember looking at the fellowship letter. What about me? There was a pause. Not an evil pause. A confused one. As if he genuinely didn't understand the question. You already have a career, Rebecca. That was the logic. Chloe needed opportunities. I had competence. Competence was treated like a permanent resource. I turned down the fellowship. 6 months later, the Riverton Herald ran a profile on Chloe. The headline called her the new face of Riverton history. I clipped the article. For years, it sat in a desk drawer. I told myself I had saved it because she was my sister. The truth was uglier. I had saved proof of my own disappearance. 3 years before the gala, I made one attempt to ask Denise directly for credit. It was almost embarrassingly small. We were finishing an oral history methodology page for the Society website. I had built most of the process: consent language, interview file naming, transcription standards, source notes. I emailed Denise. I don't need top billing. I'd just like my name to stay on the methodology and oral history pages I produced. She called me instead of replying. Rebecca, honey, this isn't academia. I know. We're a community organization. I know. A legacy belongs to everyone. I waited. Then she said the line I would hear in different forms for years. Good people don't keep score. I felt ashamed. That is what I remember most. Not angry. Ashamed. As if wanting my name on my own work proved I was petty. I'm sorry, I said. Denise Sehilt warmly. There's nothing to apologize for. Which was convenient, because I had just apologized anyway. By the week of the gala, I had become very good at not asking where my name was. That was why Denise felt safe sending me files. That was why she could write "Lifesaver" after I corrected her donor brochure and go to bed without wondering whether I had noticed who received credit on page 7. And that was why the Navy folder beside my plate changed something. The gala itself had been tense before Chloe ever hit me. I noticed, because noticing tension is part of my job. Even when the record is a room full of people instead of a box full of paper. Chloe barely touched dinner. She drank a glass of champagne during the reception, then wine at the table. Not enough that anyone would have called her drunk. Enough that the usual half-second between impulse and action had become thinner. She checked her phone constantly. Denise floated from table to table, accepting congratulations for the university project. That bothered me. The $100,000 Community Digitization Initiative had not been awarded. The Heritage Society had submitted a bid. So had several other organizations. I had helped establish technical standards for the project before bids were opened. Once I learned the society intended to bid, I had kept myself away from any informal discussions about their submission. I did not score vendors. I could not simply hand my sister a contract. But Denise never seemed interested in procurement mechanics. At one point, a donor named Warren Pike touched her arm and said, "Congratulations on landing Hensley." I was close enough to hear. Denise smiled. "We're very excited." She did not say, "We haven't landed anything." I watched her move away. Chloe saw me. "What?" "Nothing. You're doing that face." "What face?" "That librarian face where you silently correct everybody." "I'm an archivist. See? That." She smiled when she said it, but her jaw was tight. Later, during her speech, she referred to our upcoming Hensley partnership, and then to the methodology my team and I built over the last several years. That was when I knew I needed to say something. Not publicly. Not on stage. Quietly. When she came off the platform and passed our table, I leaned toward her. The contract hasn't been awarded. Her smile vanished. I know that. You just described it like it has. Oh my God, Rebecca. And if procurement asks about authorship, don't claim methodology you can't document. She stared at me. Her pupils looked slightly too bright. You couldn't let me have one night? This isn't about your night. You always do this. Do what? Make me feel stupid. I'm trying to keep you from saying something that creates a problem later. That's what you always say. She laughed once, without humor. God forbid I do anything without the family archivist checking my homework. Chloe. Her hand moved before I realized she had decided to use it. The slap was loud. The microphone came afterward. So did the laughter. So did my father's silence. The university representative's introduction shifted the room, but it didn't change me the way people might imagine. I did not look at Chloe and think, now you know who I am. I looked at my father. He looked away first. That hurt more. After the event, Denise caught me near the coat check. Chloe had disappeared toward the restroom with 2 society volunteers. Dad stood beside Denise, looking uncomfortable. Denise lowered her voice. Chloe is under extraordinary pressure. My face noticed. Rebecca. What? She had wine. She's been carrying this entire project on her shoulders. No, she hasn't. Dad flinched. Denise's expression hardened. This is exactly what I mean. What do you mean? You know how insecure she gets around you. Dad finally spoke. She thought you were humiliating her. I touched the side of my face. It was hot. I waited. I knew exactly what I was waiting for. My father to ask if I was okay. He didn't. Denise lifted the navy folder. This is what I wanted you to look at. I saw it. It's ceremonial. Then why does it need my signature? It just shows that everyone involved understands this was collaborative family work. Why does it call me University Project Sponsor/Family Liaison? That's language the committee suggested. What committee? The Society Committee. That isn't my role. It's close enough. No, it isn't. She said. This is why Chloe gets frustrated with you. Everything has to be exact. Yes. It's a ceremonial document. Then being exact shouldn't hurt anything. Dad rubbed the bridge of his nose. Rebecca, can we not do this tonight? I opened the folder. The statement was only 2 pages. I read it once. Then again. The sentence that mattered was near the bottom. The archival methods, research practices, and source materials referenced in the Riverton Heritage Society's Hensley University proposal reflect the collaborative archival work of the Shaw family and affiliated volunteers. Collaborative, family, affiliated volunteers. Words broad enough to blur almost anything. Denise held out a pen. Just sign it and go home. I looked at the line for my signature. Then at her. I don't sign records I haven't verified. Her mouth tightened. It isn't a record. Then you don't need my signature. I closed the folder. Dad said my name. Not loudly. The way he used to say it when I was 12, and Chloe was crying, and he needed me to be the older one. Rebecca. I put the folder under my arm. No, that was all. No speech. No threat. Just no. I drove home alone. At 11:30 that night, Chloe texted. Hope embarrassing me in front of everybody was worth it. I read the message twice. Then I placed my phone face down. Old habit told me to answer. I didn't mean to embarrass you. You hit me. I was only trying to help. We can talk tomorrow. I typed 3 versions. Deleted all of them. I went to bed with my face throbbing and the navy folder on my kitchen counter. The next morning, I made coffee and logged into my Hensley email. There was a message from procurement. Routine language. No crisis. No dramatic accusation. They were clarifying a phrase in the Heritage Society submission that referenced institutional familiarity with Hensley archival standards. Because I had helped create some of those standards, they wanted to know whether I had provided the bidder with any non-public guidance. I hadn't. The email included the relevant portion of the proposal. I opened it. The first page was ordinary. Mission statement. Project description. Community access. Then I reached the methodology section. One sentence stopped me. Capture provenance before presentation. I stared at it. There are phrases you remember because they're clever. That one wasn't. I remembered it because I had written it after making an embarrassing mistake early in my career. I had once spent hours cleaning and organizing a set of digital images before properly documenting the donor's original folder structure. Nothing was lost, but reconstructing what I had changed took longer than the entire initial process. After that, I wrote a training note to myself. Preserve first, normalize second, capture provenance before presentation. 7 years ago, when Denise asked me to help the society create basic digitization procedures, I had included the line in the manual. I opened my personal archive. I still had the original file, created 7 years earlier. Author, Rebecca Shaw. I went back to the proposal. The methodology section ended with, developed under the archival leadership of Chloe Shaw. For several seconds, I didn't move. My cheek had almost stopped hurting. That sentence hurt more. The first thing I felt was embarrassment. Not anger. Embarrassment that a person could be 40 years old, have a graduate degree, oversee university records, lecture students about provenance, and still feel 12 when her family put somebody else's name under her work. Then my training took over. Emotion could wait. Records first. I created a folder, Provenance Review. I copied the proposal section into it, then my original manual. I opened old society materials I had saved over the years. Brochures, exhibit PDFs, volunteer training documents, donor correspondence. I wasn't looking for revenge. At that point, I still hoped there was a boring explanation. Maybe Chloe had inherited a revised document and didn't know its origin. Maybe Denise had condensed credits badly. Maybe I had given broader permission than I remembered. I wanted the explanation to be boring. Boring meant fixable. The first file I found was from 9 years earlier. At the bottom, Research, Rebecca Shaw. A version 2 years later said, Research Assistants, Rebecca Shaw. Another version, Research Team, Riverton Heritage Society. A recent donor packet. Research led by Chloe Shaw. I sat back. Once could be formatting. Twice could be carelessness. 4 times was a pattern. I made a table. Project. Date. Original attribution. Later attribution. Supporting document. I worked for 2 hours before remembering my coffee. It was cold. At 10:13, I sent a message to the university procurement office. I disclosed that the bidder was run by members of my family, that I had previously volunteered for the organization, that portions of the submitted materials appeared related to work I had performed, and that I should not participate in vendor scoring or award recommendation. I asked that any technical clarification involving the Heritage Society be independently reviewed. Then I hit send. My stomach dropped. That surprised me. I had done exactly what professional ethics required. Still, I knew what my family would call it. Betrayal. Dad called that afternoon. Why would you put something like that in writing? I stood beside my office window, looking across campus. Because it's true. You could have called somebody. I did. Procurement. You know what I mean? Yes. Now they're gonna think something's wrong. Something may be wrong. Rebecca. What? This could cost Chloe an opportunity. No. The bid will be evaluated without me. You know how this looks. I almost laughed. That sentence. How it looks. Denise's favorite currency. How it looks isn't my job. Family should handle things privately. If a family member is bidding on a university contract I work on, private is exactly how I should not handle it. He went quiet. Then, can't you just fix whatever is wrong before somebody notices? There it was. The old job description. Rebecca fixes it. Rebecca absorbs it. Rebecca keeps everyone from looking foolish. For 16 years, a request like that had worked. This time I heard myself say, no. Dad was silent. I continued. They need to notice. Who? Whoever is responsible for evaluating the records. You're making this sound criminal. I didn't say criminal. Then what are you saying? I'm saying I'm not correcting their submission for them. His voice changed. More hurt than angry. I don't recognize you lately. The old version of me would have panicked. Would have reassured him. I'm still me. I love you. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. Instead I said, I have to get back to work. After we hung up, My hands shook. Boundaries sound powerful when people talk about them afterward. In the moment, they can feel exactly like cruelty. That night, I almost opened the Heritage Society files again. Instead, I opened a conference abstract I had started 4 months earlier. The Regional Association of Digital Collections was accepting presentations. My draft was titled, "Whose Name Survives? Community Metadata and the Ethics of Attribution." The irony was unpleasant. I had abandoned it twice because Denise needed help with society deadlines. I worked on it until 10, then submitted it. No trumpet sounded. Nobody applauded. A confirmation email arrived. "Your submission has been received." I read it 3 times. For once, I had finished my own deadline first. 2 days later, the attribution table had grown to 9 projects. That was when I found the name, R. Bell. Several accession logs from older collections showed boxes transferred to R. Bell years earlier. Some of the supporting documents I needed were missing from the Society's digital copies. Ruth Bell had been a history teacher before retiring and volunteering at the Society. I remembered her as soft-spoken, stubborn about spelling, and deeply suspicious of scanners. I called. "Ruth, it's Rebecca Shaw." There was a pause. "My goodness, Rebecca. Do you have a minute?" "For you?" "Several. I'm trying to reconstruct some accession history." "Oh Lord. That sounds promising." "It isn't." I smiled despite myself. "I found references to materials transferred to you." Another pause. "Longer. What years?" I told her. She sighed. "You'd better come over." Ruth lived 15 minutes outside Riverton, in a 1-story house with wind chimes across the porch. She led me through the kitchen and into the garage. 4 archival boxes sat on a metal shelving unit. I stopped. "You kept these?" "I was supposed to throw them out." "Who told you that?" "Denise." My pulse quickened, but I forced myself not to build the conclusion before the record. What exactly did she say? Ruth thought. She said they were duplicates. That everything important had been digitized. She told me to take them home if I was too sentimental to toss them. You didn't think that was strange? I thought it was wasteful. Did she say why they didn't need them? Space, mostly. She was reorganizing. That mattered. Ruth had not said Denise was destroying evidence. She said Denise believed or claimed the papers were no longer useful. Those were different facts. I put on gloves. The first box held event programs. The second held old donor forms. The third contained contributor sheets. That was where everything changed. A typed sheet, for the textile mill project listed. Ruth Bell tape transcription. Celia Monroe, photograph identification. Janice Orr, interview coordination. Rebecca Shaw cataloging, provenance research. 2 college interns were listed by name. I opened the public exhibit file on my laptop. The same project credited. Research Team Riverton Heritage Society. And prominently, Public History Lead, Chloe Shaw. I looked at another sheet. Then another. Name is. Tasks. Dates. Initials. I began making a list. Ruth watched me from a folding chair. What are you looking for? I'm not sure yet. That was a lie. I was beginning to know exactly what I was looking for. By the time I reached the final box, I had counted 22 people whose documented contributions had been reduced, generalized, or erased in later public materials. 22. Not just me. A retired teacher. 2 interns. A donor's daughter. 3 volunteers who had spent months identifying photographs. A man who had digitized local union newsletters. Women who had transcribed interviews no one else had patience to decipher. For years I had believed my family treated my work differently because I was Rebecca, the practical one, the one who didn't need applause, the sister who could take it. But the boxes told a different story. Denise hadn't simply been choosing Chloe over me. She had been compressing invisible work into a cleaner public narrative. 1 face. 1 success story. 1 daughter at the microphone. Ruth pulled out the last folder. This one was always yours, wasn't it? I took it. The original accession cover sheet was in my handwriting. At the bottom, compiled by Rebecca Shaw. I opened the current digital version on my laptop. Same photographs. Same collection number. Same captions I remembered writing late at night. The public credit read, Research led by Chloe Shaw. I laid the paper beside the laptop. For a long time, I just looked at the 2 lines. 2 versions of the same history. One had my name, one did not. And suddenly the question was no longer whether someone had erased me. The record had already answered that. The question was, who had been rewriting the story? And how many people had disappeared before I finally thought to look for my own name? The first thing I did was stop looking at the names as if they belonged to separate incidents. I built a ledger. Project. Contributor. Actual work. Original record. Public credit. Supporting source. Correction needed. By Sunday afternoon, the table covered 9 projects and 22 people. The pattern was too clean to dismiss. A name appeared on an early accession sheet. A year later, it became research assistants. A few years after that, it disappeared into Riverton Heritage Society team. Then, on the version sent to donors, Chloe's name rose to the top. I kept going. 7 years earlier, Denise had emailed me a draft exhibit guide with her usual instruction. Just check the dates, sweetheart. You're faster than the rest of us. The attachment still existed in my archive. I opened it with tracked changes visible. A red deletion appeared halfway down the page. Compiled by Rebecca Shaw. Below it was an insertion. Research led by Chloe Shaw. I stared at the change until the letters seemed to flatten against the screen. Then something worse happened. I remembered that evening. I had been sitting at my kitchen counter, eating crackers over the sink because I was too tired to make dinner. Denise needed the document back before 10. I corrected the date of a factory fire, fixed 2 surnames, verified a photograph number, and returned the file 40 minutes later. I had proofread the document that erased me. Denise had not forgotten to hide the revision. She had never believed she needed to. For years, she knew exactly what I would look at. The wrong year, the misspelled donor, the missing source. She also knew exactly what I would not look at. Myself. That realization changed the investigation. I stopped asking whether the missing credit had been careless. Now I needed to know whether Denise knew I objected. The answer was sitting in an email from 3 years earlier. I don't need top billing, I had written. I'd just like my name to remain on the methodology and oral history materials I produced. Her reply was still there. Chloe needs visibility right now. You already have your career. Please don't turn family work into a competition. I read it twice. There was no ambiguity left. She had known. My phone rang. Dad. I let it ring once before answering. Can we have lunch? He asked. Where? Murphy's. I almost said no. Then I looked at the email on my screen. I can give you 45 minutes. He was already in a booth when I arrived the next day. For several minutes, he talked about ordinary things. Road construction. His neighbor's new dog. The coffee being too weak. Then he folded his hands. You don't know everything about Denise. I know what's in the records. That's not what I mean. He told me about Denise's mother. She had volunteered for nearly 2 decades at a church history committee, organized photographs, typed interviews, wrote family histories. When the church published an anniversary book, the chairman's name went on the cover. Her name appeared deep in the acknowledgments. Denise never forgot it, Dad said. She used to say her mother did all the work while somebody else became important. For a moment, I saw the shape of something sad. Not an excuse. An inheritance. She promised Chloe would never end up invisible like that, he added. I looked at him across the table. So she kept Chloe visible by making other women disappear. His face tightened. That isn't fair. It's documented. She thought you didn't care about attention. I asked for credit. You have a career, Rebecca. There it was again. The old equation. Having something meant I needed nothing. Understanding why Denise feared invisibility did not make the missing names reappear. It only made the choice clearer. 2 nights later, Denise invited me to dinner. The house smelled like rosemary chicken and furniture polish. The dining table had the good linen on it. Chloe was already seated. Dad poured water into my glass as if we were about to discuss vacation plans. Denise slid a glossy brochure toward me. I opened it. On the first inside page, beneath a photograph of the Society building, were the words, Founding Collections Director Rebecca Shaw. For several seconds, I forgot how to breathe. My name, not in tiny type, Not under assistance. My name where it could be seen. Denise watched me carefully. We can announce it at the donor luncheon. Dad leaned forward. This is what you wanted. Chloe looked down at her plate. Then she said, I shouldn't have hit you. I waited. I was under a lot of pressure, she continued. And I'd been drinking. That explains your judgment, I said. It doesn't change what you did. She nodded once. It was more accountability than I had expected from her. Denise pushed another sheet across the table. A statement. It described the society's past attribution practices as collaborative and said no intentional miscrediting had occurred. There was a signature line at the bottom. Mine. The room became very quiet. For one dangerous minute, I wanted to sign. I wanted Dad to smile at me the way he had when I was 10. I wanted Christmas without strategy. I wanted to stop being the difficult one. Then I turned the brochure page. Research led by Chloe Shaw. Below that, archival, support volunteers. No Ruth. No Celia. No interns. No one. I looked at Denise. What about the other names? Her expression changed. This dinner is about fixing what happened to you. No, it isn't. Rebecca, don't turn this into a crusade. What about Ruth's transcriptions? She volunteered. What about Celia identifying the photographs? Again, volunteer work. What about the interns? Denise put down her fork. A legacy belongs to everyone. Good people don't keep score. For years, that sentence had made me feel ashamed. This time it sounded different. Credit isn't keeping score, I said. It's keeping the record honest. Dad leaned back. Please don't do this. Do what? Blow up the whole family over people who aren't even family. I stared at him. He heard himself too late. Then he said the thing that finished whatever hope I had carried into that room. If you walk out over this, don't expect us to keep pretending this family can work. Pretending. I pushed the statement back toward Denise. Then don't pretend. I left without clearing my plate. The next morning, 2 packets went out. One went to the Heritage Society board with the contributor ledger and copies of the supporting records. The other went through Hensley's formal procurement process. It updated my conflict disclosure, identified disputed attribution in the bidder's materials, and confirmed that I remained outside vendor scoring. I did not ask anyone to reject the society. I asked that the bidder verify its own provenance, permissions, and contributor records. Then I returned my society storage key. My email was short. I was no longer available for unpaid cataloging, emergency retrieval, metadata correction, donor research, or exhibit proofreading. Denise called 3 times. Dad called twice. The family group chat filled with messages. Think about what this will do to Chloe. You're embarrassing everyone. You're punishing a community organization. I started writing a long reply, then stopped. I deleted it. The issue concerns documented attribution and provenance. I will address it through the formal review. Send. Mute. That Saturday, instead of driving to the society, I went to dinner with Maya and 2 people from the preservation lab. The next morning, I booked a hotel for the Regional Digital Collections Conference using my own credit card. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. My life had been waiting quietly behind all the emergencies I kept calling obligations. A week later, Denise called a special society meeting. Board members, longtime volunteers, several donor representatives, and community partners filled the room. She spoke first. She described me as accomplished, respected, and deeply hurt. It was a clever adjustment. I was no longer useless. Now I was successful enough that I supposedly didn't need credit. A legacy belongs to everyone, Denise said. Good people don't keep score. When it was my turn, I placed the contributor ledger on the table. I gave them 3 facts. Original records named individual contributors. Later, public materials removed or generalized many of those names. At least one contributor had explicitly asked to retain attribution and had been refused. That was all. Then I said, if everyone here is comfortable with how their work is credited, nothing has to change. I sat down. Ruth was the first person to speak. Why was my name removed from the textile interviews? Denise answered quickly. No one removed it. We consolidated credits. A donor's daughter asked. Who identified my grandmother's collection? Another volunteer asked to see the attribution policy. The questions came one at a time. Denise's control began to fray. They were volunteers, she said sharply. They should be grateful they were allowed to participate. Silence. Ruth closed her notebook. A woman across the table repeated one word. Aloud. Denise immediately tried to soften it. That's not what I meant. But everyone had heard what she meant. Outside afterward, Chloe was waiting beside my car. She looked exhausted. I need to tell you something. I waited. She told me that during the past 2 years, prospective employers had occasionally asked detailed questions about projects in her portfolio. Questions about sources, interview methodology, permissions. She couldn't always answer them. Mom said you hated attention, Chloe said. She said you wanted me to use the work because I was better with people. And you believed her? At first. And later? She looked away. Later, it was easier not to ask. That was the first honest thing she had said all week. Can you write a letter saying we collaborated? There it was. The old arrangement asking to be restored one more time. No. Her eyes filled with panic. Rebecca, one letter could fix this. For you. What am I supposed to do? Make 3 lists. What you did. What I did. What everyone else did. Correct your portfolio. Will you check it? No. Then how do I know I'm doing it right? You learn. The following morning, procurement gave the society 10 business days to document provenance, contributor attribution, and permissions for the submitted materials. The bidder had to provide the records itself. On the second day, Dad called. They can't find half the permissions. Then they need to say that. On the 4th, Chloe texted. Mom doesn't understand the database. I answered. Hire someone who does. On the 6th, Denise called. You built that system. I built files. I did not agree to maintain them forever. On the 8th day, Dad showed up at my condo. He looked older than he had at the gala. You could save them. My laptop sat 10 feet away. For a few seconds, I imagined opening it, finding everything, making the panic disappear. It would have been easy. That was what made saying no difficult. I've been saving all of you from this exact problem for 16 years. So this is punishment? No. I looked at him. This is the first time the consequence belongs to the person who created it. He left. After the door closed, I cried harder than I had after Chloe slapped me. Then I made tea. I did not call him back. The society eventually hired a professional records consultant. The archive was not destroyed. Nothing criminal was uncovered. Much of the material was perfectly usable, but permissions were inconsistent, attribution needed correction, and no responsible professional could certify everything within 10 business days. The board withdrew from that procurement cycle. They lost the chance at the $100,000 project. More importantly, they had to start paying for work people like Ruth and I had been doing for free. Denise kept her chair. That surprised some people. It didn't surprise me. Consequences do not always arrive as a cardboard box outside an office. The board adopted new policies. Contributor names had to be recorded at intake. Changes to authorship required 2 approvals. Provenance corrections needed a changelog. Volunteer roles had to be documented. Denise voted against parts of it. She lost the vote. She kept the chair. She lost the ability to use it to decide who existed in the record. 2 months later, Chloe met me for coffee. Her portfolio was half as thick. She had sent corrections to several organizations and lost 1 interview because of it. She still had her real fundraising campaigns, her real public programming work, her real skills. I thought correcting everything would erase my career, she said. It erased what wasn't yours. She nodded. Will you look over the new version? Show me when it's finished. She almost smiled. That was as far as reconciliation went. For now, it was enough. Dad sent me a birthday card several months later. We miss you. Life is too short. I stared at it for a long time. Then I wrote back. I'm willing to talk when you're ready to discuss what happened and your part in it. Missing me isn't the same as taking responsibility. I mailed it before I could soften the sentence. By the following spring, I was still living in the same condo. Still working at Hensley. My conference proposal had been accepted. I was mentoring a graduate student, and once a month, During official outreach hours, I ran a small library program called the Missing Names Table. At the first session, only 11 people came. One older woman carried in a photograph of textile workers standing outside the old Cresswell mill. "I don't know all their names," she told me. I looked at the women in the picture. Years earlier, I had spent months finding names for another photograph from that same mill, while Chloe stood beneath the lights and read my words. I reached for the black archival pencil beside me. Then I placed it in front of the woman instead. "Then we start with the ones you do know." She bent over the photograph. Slowly, she wrote the first name. On the edge of the table sat a small sign. "The Missing Names Table." Underneath, in ordinary type, "Facilitated by Rebecca Shaw." My name wasn't the biggest thing in the room. It didn't need to be. For most of my life, I thought belonging meant keeping my name somewhere inside my family's story. I was 40 before I understood that my name had never needed their permission to stay. By the third month, the Missing Names Table no longer fit at the little round table where I had started it. That surprised me more than the conference acceptance had. The first session drew 11 people. The second brought 17. By October, Maya helped me move the program into one of the library's seminar rooms because people had started arriving with boxes instead of photographs. Not valuable boxes, at least not in the way auction houses use the word. A church secretary brought 30 years of handwritten choir programs. A retired machinist carried union newsletters his wife had saved in grocery bags. Two sisters arrived with their grandmother's recipe cards and argued gently over whether the woman labeled Aunt B was actually their great-aunt Bernice. The work was ordinary. That was what I liked about it. No gala lights, no speeches. No one asking me to repair something before donors arrived. On the first Thursday in October, an older man named Harold set a battered photograph on the table in front of me. My father said this was 1958. I studied the image. 8 men stood beside a delivery truck. Someone had written 4 surnames on the back. "What makes you unsure?" I asked. "The truck." I looked again. "What about it?" "The company didn't buy that model until later." I smiled. "Good." Harold blinked. "Good?" You noticed the contradiction. For the next 20 minutes, we worked backward through what he knew, instead of forcing the photograph to fit what he had been told. When he left, he still didn't have the exact year, but he had 3 new questions and a list of sources he could check. That was enough. I was stacking chairs when Maya appeared in the doorway, holding 2 coffees. "You realize normal people leave work eventually." "I'm almost done." "You said that 15 minutes ago." She handed me a cup. I took it. "Thank you." Maya nodded toward the room. "This is getting big. 26 people tonight. Rebecca, that's big." "It's 26. Last month it was 11. I know how numbers work." She leaned against the doorframe. "Have you considered letting yourself be pleased?" "I'm considering it." "That sounds exhausting." I laughed. The sound surprised me. Months earlier, I would have spent that Thursday evening at the Heritage Society, correcting somebody else's captions. Now, I was tired because I had built something I chose. There was a difference. My phone vibrated inside my bag. I ignored it until the chairs were put away. Then I looked. A message from Chloe. "Can I call you tomorrow?" Nothing urgent. The last 2 words mattered. Nothing urgent. For most of our adult lives, Chloe contacted me in one of 2 ways. She needed something now. Or she needed something yesterday. I typed, "Tomorrow, after 6 works." No rush to ask what was wrong. No knot forming in my stomach. No assumption that her problem had already become mine. The next evening, Chloe called at 6:12. I got the job. I sat down at my kitchen counter. "The museum position?" "Yeah, that's good." "It's not the same title." "What do you mean?" The posting changed after the first interview. They offered me community outreach coordinator instead of program manager. She gave a small laugh. "Turns out when half your portfolio disappears, people adjust expectations." There was no accusation in her voice. Mostly embarrassment. "What will you actually be doing?" "Public programming. School partnerships. Fundraising events. Some donor communication." Things she was genuinely good at. That sounds more like you. I thought you'd say it sounded like a demotion. I don't know enough about their structure to say that. A pause. Then Chloe said, "Mom called it humiliating." Of course she had. "What do you think?" "I think I can do the job." That answer was different from anything I would have heard from Chloe a year earlier. Not, "I deserve the title." Not, "They don't understand me." Just, "I can do the job." "That seems like the important part," I said. She was quiet. Then, "They asked about the corrections." I waited. I told them the truth. What truth? That several projects in my old portfolio included work I didn't do. That I corrected the materials after I learned how much of the attribution was wrong. "You knew some of it was wrong before then." Another pause. "You're right." I appreciated that she didn't defend herself. "I told them that too," she said. "Not every detail, but enough." "And they still offered you the job." "Yeah." Her voice broke slightly on the word. I knew what she was learning. Accountability had cost her something. It had not ended her life. There was a world after being wrong. Our parents had never taught either of us that. "I'm glad for you," I said. "Thanks." Then Chloe asked, "Would you have coffee with me Sunday?" I looked at my calendar. Old Rebecca would have answered before checking. "I can do 11. Okay." Another pause. "Rebecca?" "Yeah?" "I know you don't want to talk about Mom." "I don't mind facts." That is such an archivist answer. "It's the answer I have," Chloe said. "The society's having problems." I closed my eyes. There it was. Not urgent, but adjacent to urgent. "What kind?" "Volunteer hours are way down." "That makes sense." "Mom says people are punishing her." "What do you think?" "I think people got used to doing more than they were credited for." That sentence had clearly cost her something. I let the silence sit. Chloe continued, "They hired another part-time records person." "Good." "It costs more than Mom expected." I smiled without humor. I knew roughly what professional archival work cost. Denise had known too. She had simply never paid it when I was available. "Is there something you need from me?" I asked. "No." That answer mattered almost as much as nothing urgent. "No," Chloe repeated. "I just wanted you to know." "Okay." We talked about her new commute for another 5 minutes. When the call ended, I did not open the society website. I did not search their volunteer calendar. I did not check whether the new records employee was handling the collections correctly. I made dinner. That should not have felt revolutionary. It did. The next intrusion came in a more polished form. A week later, Maya brought a printed invitation to my office. This arrived downstairs. I glanced at the logo, Riverton Heritage Society. My shoulders tightened before I even read the first line. They were hosting a winter donor reception. The program included a panel called "Preserving Every Voice: Riverton's New Commitment to Community Attribution." Under invited panelists, Rebecca Shaw, Hensley University. I had not agreed to participate. I read the line again. Maya watched my face. "Did you know about this?" "No." "You want me to accidentally shred it?" "No." "Worth asking." I scanned the rest. The invitation described the Society's newly adopted attribution reforms without explaining why those reforms existed. Denise was listed as moderator. Of course she was. The pattern was so familiar I almost admired its efficiency. Something threatened her narrative. She absorbed it, renamed it, then stood at the microphone as if she had invented the correction. My first impulse was anger. The second was older and more dangerous. Go there. Make sure she tells it correctly. That was the trap. If Denise announced me as a panelist without asking, she was betting on the same thing she had always bet on: that I would show up to prevent the consequences of her assumption. I opened my email. I copied the Society Board Secretary because the invitation was an official Society communication. I received the winter reception invitation today. I did not agree to participate in this panel and will not be attending. Please remove my name from future promotional materials unless I have provided written consent. I read it once. No accusations. No history lesson. Send. Less than 10 minutes later, Denise called. I watched her name flash across my phone until it stopped. Then came a voicemail. "Rebecca, this is ridiculous. The panel is about exactly the issue you claimed mattered so much. We are trying to show the community that we listened." I did not call back. 5 minutes later, another voicemail. This makes us look divided. That one nearly made me laugh. We were divided. The invitation did not create that fact. It only tried to cover it with a panel title. I forwarded both messages to my personal archive, not because I planned to use them against anyone, but because they related to unauthorized professional representation. Then I went back to work. The next morning, the society's online invitation no longer included my name. No confrontation. No public correction. Just removal. Months earlier, that would have felt unsatisfying. Now it felt clean. That afternoon, the director of community collections stopped by my office. I heard about your outreach program. The missing names table? She nodded. We have discretionary funds for spring programming. I'd like to expand it to 2 neighborhood branches if you're interested. My old reflex arrived immediately. I began calculating whether I could fit it around society work. Then I caught myself. There was no society work. That time existed because I had taken it back. What would the hours look like? I asked. She explained. Paid planning time. 2 Saturdays per month for 3 months. A graduate assistant provided through the library. No unpaid evenings hidden behind the word community. I'd like to do it, I said. The answer felt strangely physical, like moving furniture in a room I had lived in for years and suddenly realizing the floor underneath it belonged to me. Sunday morning, Chloe was already at the coffee shop when I arrived. She had cut several inches off her hair. I noticed because she kept touching the ends. You changed it. She smiled nervously. I wanted to. Not, Mom thought it looked more professional. Not, the museum suggested it. Just wanted. We ordered coffee. For the first 20 minutes, we talked about nothing important. Her new job. My program. A terrible parking garage near campus. Then Chloe took a folded sheet of paper from her bag. I looked at it, but didn't reach for it. What is that? A list. What list? Corrections I still need to make. I sat back. I told you I'm not checking your work. I know. She kept the paper on her side of the table. I'm not asking you to. That made me look at her differently. There's one thing I wanted to tell you. Okay. One of the projects I thought was mine actually was mostly mine. I waited. The Veterans Oral History Fundraiser. I built the donor plan, organized the event, recruited schools. You did the preservation workflow. That sounds right. For years, I thought if I admitted the other things weren't mine, then none of it was. I understood that more than I wanted to. Denise had built our roles out of absolutes. Chloe was visible. I was useful. If one of those labels cracked, the whole identity seemed threatened. You're allowed to keep what you actually earned, I said. She stared into her coffee. So are you. It was not an apology. But it was closer to recognition than anything she had ever given me without being cornered. I let it be what it was. When we left, she hugged me. I hugged her back. Briefly. No promise about Christmas. No declaration that everything was fixed. 2 people standing on a sidewalk, trying something less dishonest than before. Dad remained harder. His birthday card had been followed by silence. Then, in November, an envelope arrived. No Hallmark message this time. Just 2 pages in his handwriting. The first page was mostly explanation. He had wanted peace. Denise had been trying to protect Chloe. He had believed I was stronger. Halfway down the second page, one sentence stopped me. I watched Chloe hit you, and I worried first about what you would do next, instead of what had just been done to you. I read it again. That was different. Not enough, but different. Then, I have spent years calling your endurance strength when it was often just convenient for me. I put the letter down. My chest felt tight. There was no request at the bottom. No call me. No life is too short. Just, I am sorry. I understand if that does not repair anything. For the first time, he had named his own action without making me responsible for comforting him afterward. I did not call that night, or the next. 3 days later, I wrote, I received your letter. Thank you for naming what happened clearly. I'm not ready to return to the way things were. I would be willing to have coffee after the holidays. That was all I could honestly offer. It was also more than I had expected to offer. The December session of the missing names table filled every seat. At the end, I found the same woman from the textile mill photograph packing her papers. She waved me over. I found 4 more. She showed me the photograph. 4 question marks were gone. 4 names had been added in careful pencil. One woman still had no name. Still working on her, she said. I ran a finger just above the sleeve, careful not to touch the image. You don't have to solve everything at once. The words left my mouth before I realized I was saying them to myself too. She smiled. I suppose not. After everyone left, I stood alone in the seminar room. 20 empty chairs, pencils scattered across the tables, boxes waiting to be returned, names written where blanks had been. There were still things in my own life without tidy labels. Denise had not apologized. Dad might change or might retreat again. Chloe and I were rebuilding something too new to call trust. None of that made the work in front of me less real. I switched off the lights and locked the seminar room. For years, I had believed an unfinished record meant I had failed. Now I understood something quieter. Sometimes the honest thing was not to invent the missing piece. Sometimes you preserved what you knew, marked what you didn't, and left enough room for the truth to arrive later. January arrived with gray skies, salt crusted along the curb, and a calendar that no longer belonged to the Heritage Society. That still felt strange. For years, January had meant inventory corrections, donor acknowledgments, and Denise calling after dinner because somebody had entered a collection date incorrectly. This year, the first Saturday on my calendar said something else. Community archive planning. Paid. Approved. Mine. The library had funded an expanded version of the missing names table for the spring. Instead of one monthly session on campus, we would rotate through 2 neighborhood branches. A graduate assistant would handle registration and setup. My planning hours were part of my regular workload. The distinction mattered more than I expected. Work could be meaningful without becoming a debt. Maya found me measuring archival sleeves in the supply room. You look suspiciously cheerful. I'm comparing polyester dimensions. Exactly. Suspicious. I handed her a box. The East Branch expects about 30 people for the first session. That little table of yours is becoming an empire. Don't call it that. A republic? Worse. Fine. A moderately organized gathering of people with pencils. That I can accept. She laughed and carried the box toward the cart. The elevator doors opened before we reached them. Denise stepped out. For 1 second, I thought my brain had filled in the wrong person. She was wearing a camel coat, leather gloves, and the expression she used when entering rooms she expected to recognize her. In her arms was a gray archival box. Maya glanced at me. I'll take these downstairs, she said. She did not ask whether I wanted help. She did not stand guard. She simply gave me the dignity of deciding what happened next. Denise waited until the elevator doors closed. So this is where you do it. Do what? The program. Yes. Her gaze moved over the supply room. I expected something more public. We use the seminar room. She looked at the gray box in her hands. I brought you something. That sentence once would have made me reach for it automatically. I didn't. What is it? My mother's papers. My chest tightened. Denise set the box on an empty cart and removed the lid. Inside were church bulletins, handwritten committee minutes, photographs, typed pages with penciled corrections, and a thick anniversary book bound in burgundy cloth. I recognized the kind of material immediately. Working papers. The things that remain after the polished version has forgotten how much labor produced it. Denise opened the anniversary book. Her name is here. She pointed near the back. Acknowledgements. A list of volunteers in small type. Her mother's name sat in the middle of the paragraph. She spent 19 years on that committee, Denise said. 19. She interviewed half the people in this book. She organized the photographs. She rewrote the cemetery section because the chairman had half the dates wrong. Her finger pressed harder against the page. And this is what they gave her. I looked at the name, then at the papers. What would you like the library to do? She seemed irritated by the question. Preserve it. We can evaluate it for donation. And correct the record. That depends on what the records support. Her eyes came up. You know what she did. I know what Dad told me. Now you're telling me more. Neither is the same as documentation. She stared at me as if I had insulted her. There are her notes right here. Then those may support attribution. May? We'd review them. You're the senior archivist. Yes. So review them. There it was. Not a request for the library. A request for Rebecca. Special access. Personal labor. The old door, wearing a new coat of paint. There's an intake process, I said. I can give you the form. Her mouth hardened. You're going to make me fill out a form for my own mother? Everyone fills out the form. After everything I've done for this community? I almost answered too quickly. Instead, I looked down at the anniversary book. You want her work recognized because someone used it and put somebody else's name at the front? Denise closed the book. That is completely different. How? She was overlooked. So were Ruth and Celia. That was volunteer work. So was your mother's. Color rose along Denise's neck. You are determined to make me a villain. No. Then what are you doing? Using the same standard for everyone. She gave a short, disbelieving laugh. That's easy for you to say now that you've gotten what you wanted. What did I get? You got your little public program. You got the board changing policies. Chloe had to humiliate herself, sending corrections. Your father barely comes home without talking about how badly he handled everything. I absorbed that carefully. Dad had not told me what he discussed at home, so I did not pretend I knew more than Denise had just revealed. What I wanted was accurate attribution. You wanted to punish me. If I wanted to punish you, I wouldn't be offering to preserve your mother's papers. She went still. I pulled an intake form from the cabinet. If you donate them, they'll be evaluated like any other collection. If the notes show what you say they show, that becomes part of the record. We won't invent anything. We won't erase anything either. Denise looked at the form, then at me. You really would do this to me? The old version of me would have softened immediately. I would have explained for 10 minutes. I would have told her I understood. Instead, I said, I'm not doing anything to you. She replaced the lid. Then she picked up the box. For a moment I thought she might leave the form behind. She took it. That mattered, though I refused to give it more meaning than it had earned. Your mother deserves to have what she actually did preserved, I said. Denise paused by the elevator. So did you. The doors opened. She stepped inside before I could answer. I stood there long after they closed. She had not apologized. She had not admitted anything. But for the first time, Denise had said aloud that I deserved credit without attaching a signature line to the sentence. It was not reconciliation. It was one fact. I had learned to stop demanding that one fact carry the weight of an entire relationship. Dad and I met for coffee 2 weeks later. He had chosen a place near campus instead of Murphy's. Neutral ground. He arrived early. I noticed because he used to be late whenever the meeting concerned me, and early whenever Denise needed something done. Maybe that meant nothing. I was trying to get better at letting facts remain facts until a pattern existed. He held his cup between both hands. Thank you for coming. You asked clearly. He nodded. I've been thinking about that. About coffee? About asking clearly. His smile disappeared. I spent a lot of years making requests sound like emergencies. I waited. He looked out the window. When you were young, you made things easier. That wasn't my job. No. The answer came quickly. That was new, he continued. After your mother died, I depended on that. Then Denise came along. Chloe was little, and somehow everybody got used to the idea that you were the one person who didn't need anything. I did need things. I know. No, Dad. I need you to understand this part. I wasn't unusually mature because I had no needs. I learned not to show them because being easy made adults happy. He looked down. That's hard to hear. It was harder to live. He nodded again. No defense. We sat with that. Then he said, Denise told me she came to see you. She brought her mother's papers. She was furious when she came home. I can imagine. She also filled out the form. That surprised me enough that I looked up. You saw it? She asked me for the dates of her mother's committee work. I almost smiled. Not because Denise had changed. Because paperwork had accomplished something arguments never had. The rules applied to her too. Dad rubbed his thumb along the seam of his coffee cup. She thinks you built the new policies to take power away from her. I didn't write the policies. I know. Do you? Yes. He met my eyes. The board did that after seeing the records you provided. I understand the difference now. That sentence mattered. Months earlier, he would have said I had caused everything. Now he could separate my action from other people's response. I took a sip of coffee. "What are you asking from me today?" He flinched slightly. It was a question I had started using, because I was tired of conversations where the real request arrived, disguised as guilt. "Nothing." I waited. He gave a tired smile. "You don't believe me. I'm learning to check." "Fair." He set his cup down. "I wanted to see you. That's different from wanting me to fix something." "I know." We talked for another 40 minutes. Nothing dramatic happened. He did not ask me to forgive Denise. He did not ask me to return to the society. When he mentioned Chloe's new job, he said, "She seems nervous, but she's working hard." Not, "Maybe you could help her." That omission was almost louder than the rest of the conversation. At the end, Dad stood beside his car. "Could we do this again?" I considered the question instead of answering automatically. "Next month." His face softened. "Okay." I drove home feeling both lighter and sadder. Repair was slower than anger. There was no single moment where a relationship became safe again. You watched what happened after the apology. Then what happened after the boundary. Then what happened when the person did not get what they wanted. Records over promises. A month later, I stood behind a lectern at the Regional Digital Collections Conference with 112 people in the room. I knew the number because the organizers had told me registration was full. My presentation was called, "Whose Name Survives?" 10 years earlier, I would have laughed if anyone suggested I would voluntarily stand behind a microphone. Chloe had been the one who connected with people. I had been the one who preferred the work. At least, that was the story we had repeated until preference hardened into identity. My hands trembled when the moderator introduced me. Then I looked at the first slide. A photograph. 6 women. 5 names. 1. ? The same image Aaron and I had discussed months earlier. I talked about provenance, attribution, and the way community records often preserve the visible person while losing the people who made visibility possible. I never mentioned Denise. I never mentioned Chloe. The presentation did not belong to them. Afterward, a woman from a county library raised her hand. "How do you keep attribution work from becoming an argument about ego?" A year earlier, I might have given a careful academic answer. Instead, I said, "By remembering that credit is not applause, it's information." Pens moved across notebooks. Nobody laughed. Nobody turned pale. Nobody needed to. When the session ended, the moderator thanked me by name. I packed my own laptop. Then I walked out of the room without checking whether anyone in Riverton would have been impressed. That evening, back at the hotel, an email waited in my inbox. It was from the Heritage Society's General Collections address, not Denise's personal account. Subject: Proposed donation, Margaret Hale, Church History Papers. Margaret Hale, Denise's mother. Attached was a completed intake form. Under known creator or contributor, Denise had written, "Margaret Hale, research, interviews, photograph organization, date verification, extent to be confirmed through collection review." I read the sentence twice. She had not written, "primary author." She had not written, "the woman who did everything." She had written what could be investigated, what could be supported, what could become part of a record instead of a legend. At the bottom, under donor notes, there was one additional sentence. "Please preserve the names of other volunteers where documentation supports them." I sat very still. This was not an apology. It did not erase what she had done. It did not restore years. But it was the first action I had seen from Denise that did not require someone else to become smaller for her mother to become visible. I closed the laptop. For once, I did not need to decide immediately what it meant. Some truths arrived loudly. Others needed time before you could tell whether they were a change or only a correction. I had spent most of my life rushing to fill every blank. Now I knew enough to leave one open. The Margaret Hale papers arrived at Hensley 3 weeks after I came home from the conference. Not through me. That detail mattered. Denise followed the same intake process as everyone else. She signed the donor agreement, provided what she knew about the collection, and delivered 4 archival boxes to the library loading desk on a Tuesday morning. I learned they had arrived because the collection system generated a notification. For several seconds, I stared at her mother's name on my screen. Then I opened the intake record. No special instructions. No demand for expedited processing. No note saying the donor expected approval over how the collection would be described. Under known contributors, Denise had entered 6 names besides her mother's. 2. I recognized from the church anniversary book. 4. I didn't. The woman who had spent years deciding whose name belonged near the top of a page had voluntarily written other people into the record. That did not undo anything. But it was information, and information deserved to be handled accurately. I assigned the preliminary inventory to the same workflow we used for comparable community collections. Because of my personal connection, I documented it in the project notes and asked Maya to perform the secondary review after I completed the initial description. She looked at me over her monitor. You sure you want to be the one opening those boxes? Yes. Professional answer or Rebecca answer? Both. Maya considered that. Okay. That was one of the things I had grown to appreciate about the people around me. They could ask whether I was sure without deciding for me. The first box contained church programs. The second held photographs. The third was mostly correspondence. The fourth was where Margaret Hale's work became visible. Interview notes in her handwriting. Photograph lists with corrections in the margins. Cemetery records she had cross-checked against newspaper obituaries. Draft pages covered in edits. I found 3 versions of a section about Riverton's oldest Black congregation. The published anniversary book credited the committee chairman as editor. Margaret's drafts showed she had rewritten almost the entire section after discovering 2 names had been conflated. I sat back. For a moment, I understood Denise in a way I had not wanted to. This was not a story she had invented. Her mother really had done work that disappeared inside a cleaner public narrative. The tragedy was that Denise had learned the wrong lesson from it. She had not learned to preserve everyone's contribution. She had learned that visibility was scarce. If Chloe stood in the light, somebody else had to stand behind the curtain. I opened the contributor sheet. Margaret Hale. Research. Interviews. Photograph. Organization. Verification. Then I added the other names supported by the documents. Not because Denise had requested it, because the evidence did. On the bottom of one draft, Margaret had written a note beside a paragraph corrected by another volunteer. Ask Helen. She knows this family better than I do. I smiled. There it was. A woman Denise had spent years turning into a symbol of stolen credit had known something Denise had forgotten, knowing when somebody else deserved the name. I scanned the note for the working file. Then I moved on. 2 days later, Denise emailed. Not called. Emailed. May I ask whether the collection has been reviewed yet? I replied with the standard language. Preliminary inventory is underway. You'll receive the collection description when the review is complete. 10 minutes passed. Then, thank you. Nothing else. I almost checked the timestamp twice. Instead, I closed the message. Change, when it was real, did not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it was simply a person accepting the same process they once believed should bend around them. The next missing names table session took place at the East Branch. 34 people registered. The graduate assistant assigned to the program, Lena, had arranged pencils, sleeves, forms, and magnifying sheets before I arrived. For years, setup had meant doing everything myself, because relying on anyone else felt dangerous. Now I walked into a room where somebody competent had completed a task without me supervising each step. Nothing collapsed. Lena pointed toward the coffee station. I labeled the decaf. You're already better at community outreach than I am. She grinned. You say that like labeling the decaf isn't archival science. It's provenance. Exactly. The room filled. Halfway through the session, a woman brought me a recipe notebook with 3 different kinds of handwriting. My grandmother's, she said. All of it? She hesitated. I assumed so. We spent several minutes comparing the hands. One used a looping capital R. Another printed ingredient measurements in block letters. A third wrote notes in pencil. The woman frowned. I never noticed. That's why we don't start by deciding the answer. What do we start with? What you can support. She looked at the notebook again. So I might have 3 women here. Maybe. Her face changed. Not disappointment. Wonder. That was what I wanted the program to become. Not a place where I supplied answers. A place where people learned to ask better questions. When the session ended, Lena handed me the attendance sheet. We have a waiting list for next month. How many? 12. I stared at her. She laughed. You're allowed to be happy about this. Maya says that too. Maybe everyone but you knows something. I folded the sheet. This time I let myself smile. All right. All right, what? I'm happy. Documented. Don't push it. At home that evening, there was a voicemail from Dad. Not urgent. He had learned that phrase too. Rebecca, just wanted to say I hope the branch program went well. No need to call tonight. Coffee next Saturday still works for me. I replayed it once, then deleted it. Not because it didn't matter. Because I no longer needed to archive every decent moment as proof that the relationship might survive. Saturday coffee had become something modest. Dad arrived on time. Sometimes we talked about what happened. Sometimes we didn't. That week he asked about the Heritage Society. I heard they're hiring another part-time records assistant. I haven't checked. He gave me a surprised look. You really don't know? No. Months earlier, I would have known their staffing calendar better than my own. He stirred his coffee. Denise is still angry about some of the board rules. I'm not surprised. She follows them. That's more important. He nodded. Then he said, she told me you found evidence supporting her mother's work. I found records supporting specific contributions. He smiled faintly. Still exact. Yes, I used to think that was difficult. And now? I think sometimes difficult was the word we used when you wouldn't make things convenient. I looked at him. There was no defense after it. No request for praise. That made the sentence worth more. Before we left, Dad asked, would you come to dinner sometime? The old answer rose immediately. Of course. Then the newer part of me asked a question. Who will be there? Denise. Chloe? If she's free. What kind of dinner? He blinked. Food? I laughed. I mean, is this a reconciliation ambush? No. You're sure? Yes. Will Denise know I'm coming? Yes. Does she expect me to discuss the society? I'll tell her not to. I considered it. Not because I was afraid to lose him if I refused. Because I was deciding whether I wanted to go. I can do dinner in 2 weeks. Dad nodded. 2 weeks. That difference was almost invisible. Once, invitations from that house were assignments. Now they were invitations. 2 weeks later, I parked outside the house where I had spent most of my childhood and sat in the car for an extra minute. My body remembered before my mind did. The urge to prepare, to anticipate, to enter already useful. I had brought nothing. No corrected brochure. No dessert because Denise might forget. No folder. No laptop. Just myself. Chloe opened the door. You came. I said I would. I know. She stepped aside. Her new museum badge was clipped to her purse. Job going okay? I asked. I got yelled at by a 3rd grader because our dinosaur exhibit doesn't have dinosaurs. That seems like legitimate criticism. It's a local history museum. Children are uncompromising stakeholders. She laughed. The sound followed us into the dining room. Denise was putting serving dishes on the table. She looked at me. For one uncomfortable second, neither of us knew what script to use. Then she said, dinner's almost ready. Okay. No hug. No performance. Dad poured water. We sat. Halfway through the meal, Denise spoke. I received the preliminary collection description. I put down my fork. It's still subject to secondary review. I know. She looked at her plate. You included Helen Carter. The document supported her contribution. My mother barely mentioned Helen when I was growing up. There were several notes telling the committee to consult her. Denise nodded. She must have trusted her. Yes. Silence settled. Then Denise said, I spent years being angry that people reduced my mother's work. I waited. I thought the answer was making sure Chloe could never be reduced. Chloe stopped eating. Denise looked toward her, then back at me. I didn't ask what that required from anyone else. It was not a complete apology. She did not name every file, every removed credit. Every time she called my work petty, I could have forced the inventory. I could have listed each offense until the confession matched the record. That would have been the old version of exactness. Exactness used as a way to control uncertainty. Instead, I asked one question. Do you understand why I won't work for the society again? Denise's eyes shifted toward me. Yes. The word came slowly. Then she added, I don't like it. That wasn't the question. A small, reluctant smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. No, I suppose it wasn't. I'm not coming back. I know. There it was. A boundary acknowledged without negotiation. That mattered more to me than a prettier apology. After dinner, Denise did not ask me to look at anything. Dad did not carry out a broken printer. Chloe did not hand me her resume. I left with the same empty hands I had arrived with. The house stayed standing. So did I. By early summer, the expanded missing names table had become a permanent part of Hensley's community outreach calendar. Not mine in the possessive sense. That surprised me too. Lena could run a session without me. Another archivist led one workshop. The branch librarians adapted the materials. For years, I had equated being necessary with being valuable. Now I was building something that became stronger when other people could carry parts of it. At the final spring session, the older woman with the textile mill photograph returned. She placed the image carefully on the table. Remember the last woman? The one with no name. I do. She smiled. Evelyn Porter. How did you find her? A funeral notice. Then her niece confirmed the photograph. She showed me the notes she had made. Source. Date. Who confirmed it? I felt something warm move through my chest. You documented it. You taught me to. No, I said. I showed you how. She looked puzzled by the distinction. I understood it perfectly. She picked up the black archival pencil and wrote, Evelyn Porter. 30 women. 30 names. No question marks. Around us, conversations continued. Paper moved. Someone laughed near the windows. A child asked his grandmother who a man was in an old wedding photograph. On the edge of the table sat the same modest sign. The missing names table, facilitated by Rebecca Shaw. Once, I would have looked at my own name first. That afternoon, I barely noticed it. I was looking at Evelyn Porter, at a woman who had stood outside a textile mill decades before I was born, unaware that one day somebody might need to fight the slow machinery of forgetting to put her name back beside her face. For most of my life, I thought belonging meant making myself indispensable. I fixed the dates. I carried the boxes. I stayed late. I gave up opportunities. I told myself that if I was useful enough, patient enough, easy enough, there would always be a place for me. There was. It just wasn't a place I wanted anymore. The life I had now was quieter. A condo with a mortgage in my name. Work I was paid to do. Friends who asked instead of assumed. A sister learning to own only what she had earned. A father learning that love did not excuse passivity. A stepmother who still wanted control. Still resisted some consequences, but now had to live inside rules she could not rewrite. And a table where nobody had to earn the right to have their name recorded. When the room emptied, I found one archival pencil left near the photograph. I picked it up. For a second, I remembered being 10 years old on the living room floor, writing my mother's name on the back of a Christmas picture because I was terrified forgetting could make someone disappear. I had been wrong about one thing. A name could disappear from a page. It could disappear from a caption. Someone could even spend years pretending the work beneath it belonged to somebody else. But that did not give them ownership of the person. I slid the pencil into its box and closed the lid. For most of my life, I thought I needed my family to leave my name somewhere inside their story. At 40, I knew better. My name had never needed their permission to stay.